Welcome everybody to Setting Targets and Monitoring Progress, which is one of 3 in the From Ambition to Action series. This is a series that aims to support organisations and businesses to practically reduce their environmental impact. And it's organised by CCF in partnership with IIE, so CCF, Cambridge Carbon Footprint, and IIE, Investors in the Environment, and with support from Cambridge City Council. So the aim is for our attendees to leave these sessions with a better understanding of practical step-by-step processes and tools that you can use to make your workplaces or organisations more sustainable. So this session is being recorded, as you may have gathered from my last comment, and it will be posted on YouTube. Post-event, we're going to share slides, the recording and the chat. We usually get asked that, so just to let you know up front. If you don't want to be in camera, please just switch your video off, and please ensure you stay muted unless you're specifically asked to unmute yourself. If you do have any issues with Zoom or technology, please let us know via chat if you can. If you're having connection issues, sometimes switching your video off can help with that. And I'm going to allow Jane and Warren to introduce themselves, but suffice to say they've got an awful lot of years of experience individually and between them. I've worked with the both of them personally, so I know they're not only extremely knowledgeable, they're also extremely nice human beings generally. But they'll introduce themselves. Just to introduce myself briefly, for those of you that haven't already seen some of these sessions, I'm Claire Watters. I've got somewhere around 10 years of experience working with a variety of businesses, supporting them to make environmental improvements and get environmental management systems in place and achieve various accreditations. I work for IIE now, and I have done for just over a year. IIE supports organisations to improve their environmental performance through environmental management systems, or EMSs I may refer to them as, or the speakers may refer to them as, and also to gain accreditation to IIE standards. And as well as working for IIE, I also volunteer as a trustee for CCF. So just to tell you a bit about CCF and what a great organisation they are, that's why I volunteer for them. CCF raises awareness of the climate crisis and supports people to move to low carbon living. They've been delivering an average of 65 events a year over the last 15 years with the support of thousands of volunteers. They're well known for open eco homes, which I do a fair bit of volunteer work on, home energy workshops, being the key partner in the Cambridgeshire Repair Cafe network, and for hosting Cambridge's sustainable fashion festivals. Some relatively new work includes the Cambridge Climate Change Charter and Net Zero Now, which is a training course for new climate leaders. I'm showing here on the screen a web page of the Climate Charter. Please do sign up to the Carbon Charter. It has 2 ways you can sign up to. You can either go in as an individual and make individual commitments, or we're hoping that a lot of you are coming representing your business or organisation and will sign up on behalf of your business or organisation. And the business focused commitments have more broad but important commitments that are things like writing an environmental policy, calculating your carbon footprint, etc. And CCF will be following up on those that have committed, and hopefully we'll make a nice community out of that. So just to tell you what's going to happen today, hopefully everyone's arrived now. Once I've finished my preamble, I will hand over to Jane. She's going to talk a bit about agreeing action plans and putting an environmental management system in place. Then we will hand over to Warren, and he's going to talk about the importance of setting targets and monitoring and controlling, and he's going to particularly focus on energy. It says on waste. I thought Jane was going to do more about waste, but we'll see. And there's also, Warren's got a couple of case studies from 2 SMEs, small to medium enterprises, for those of you who might not be sure what that means. We'll have ample time for questions at the end of those two presentations. If you do have a question, please just type it in the chat. And when we get to the Q&A session, I will field out the queries to the most appropriate speaker, as well as Jane and Warren. We've also got Nicole Barton from CCF, who will be able to answer any CCF specific queries, and she's also in the background helping out with the organisation of the event. About 5 minutes before the end, I'll take you through next steps, and I'm aiming to finish fairly promptly at 3 o'clock. But before I hand over to Jane, I just wanted to take you through some sustainability jargon. And it's important because one of the first things that we're looking at, or you should be looking at when you put environmental management system in place, is outlining your ambitions. And it may be that that's something which is just an internal communication, but it's more likely that that might be on your website or some sort of publicly available document. So an environmental policy, say, which is available on a notice board that other people can see, or on your website. So you really need to make sure you're getting these terms right and avoiding any accusations of greenwash. So I've put lots of different words up here that are fairly common, and I'm not going to go through all of them because that would take the whole day, but I'm just going to give you a few examples. So many years ago, I was auditing an environmental policy for a stationery company. And one of the bullet points in their policy was that they offered environmentally friendly products. So I looked at that, and I looked at the products that they were offering, and I had to point out to the gentleman in question that what he actually offered was product that had recyclable content in them and FSC content. There wasn't really any wider considerations about packaging, waste produced, the energy, the transport, etc., etc. So it was just this really broad, vague, environmentally friendly term. So we agreed in the end that he would change that bullet point to they offered products that have recycled content and FSC content, which I was very happy with, and he was very happy with as well. So in that case, using a more specific term was the right way to go, rather than just slapping a blanket sustainable or environmentally friendly or green term on it, to use the exact terminology for what he was referring to. I just wanted to take you through a couple of other examples that also crop up often. So recycle and reuse, often they seem to be used interchangeably as though they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. Sorry, I might be treading on your toes slightly here, Jane. So reusing refers to using an object again without treatment, whereas recycling means turning the item into a raw material that can be used again, usually for a completely new product. So reusing reduces pollution and waste, thus making it a more sustainable process. So if you're reusing something but referring to as recycling, you're actually giving yourself not enough credit. And if you're doing it the other way around, you're giving yourself too much credit. So you need to understand what these terms mean to make sure you're being accurate in your descriptions. What were the other ones? There's a lot around carbon neutrality, carbon offsetting, net zero carbon. So I wanted to go through those and try to get a better understanding of those. So the difference between carbon neutral and net zero carbon. So carbon neutral is balancing out the total amount of carbon emissions. So calculating your carbon footprint, which we talked about in the last session, defining clearly what scope is included or what scopes are included within that carbon footprint, exactly what's in there, and then balancing it with offsets. So it's, of the two, probably relatively easy or easier than becoming net zero carbon, because net zero carbon means that no carbon was emitted from the start. And that's done by the business working to significantly reduce their energy use as a starting point, And then they bought, or preferably even self-generated renewable energy, and only used offsets from a credible source as an absolute last resort. So that's the difference between those two. And I'll also just mention carbon positive, that's looking at more than offsetting your carbon emissions to make yourselves carbon positive, which is another kind of buzzword out there. And the last one I wanted to talk about was zero waste. Just because I've audited a couple of businesses recently who have told me they're zero waste, but when I've looked into how they deal with their waste, it actually turns out that maybe they aren't even segregating recycling. They're just putting something into one big bin, and then the waste provider is actually segregating through that, recycling what can be recycled, and then incinerating the rest. That is not zero waste. So zero waste is the conservation of all resources without burning and with no discharges to land, water, or air that threaten the environment or human health. So that's what zero waste is. So that's some of the terms. You can Google search any of those, and there's plenty of good explanations out there. If you do want any further terms explained, then maybe ask in the chat, and I'll try my best to give you a good explanation. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Jane.
Good afternoon. Right, I'm Jane Varley. I manage the Green Business Network, which has been in existence for around 25 years. We started in Bedfordshire. We're currently operating in Milton Keynes and Northamptonshire as well, and little bits of Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, and anybody else who wants to join in with us, really. Our aim is to ensure that businesses minimise and reduce and indeed eliminate their impact on the environment. To achieve that, essentially, we share best practice through a whole variety of programmes. Right, today I want to, first of all, take a look at waste and also then move on to looking at ISO 14001, which is the Environmental Management Systems. It's an international standard. So without further ado, I will continue. Okay, so lady in the picture here is Nora Winterburn. It's my grandmother. She was a riveter in World War I. She played football for Bolton Wanderers ladies in the 1920s and 30s, and she taught me how not to waste stuff. She was brought up in the Depression. Money was extremely tight, and actually when I was young, which is quite a long time ago now, money was quite tight then too. And you didn't waste stuff. You didn't waste food, you didn't waste the stuff that came into your house. And I've basically been brought up with that as one of my core values. That is one of the reasons I became quite engrossed in the green agenda to start off with. And really my involvement I started actually working for the network as communications manager, and I've ended up managing the whole thing. But I am absolutely committed to getting rid of waste wherever it exists. Okay, so we've got the waste hierarchy. You're probably familiar with some of this at least. There's prevent and reduce, obviously, so eliminate or reduce. Preparation for reuse, so that could be sanding something down, quite simply, or putting a product into a state where it can be reused. Recycling and composting. There's recovery, which is effectively burning stuff, and landfill. The least desirable, obviously, is landfill, but just can I draw your attention to recycling? It comes quite a long way down that hierarchy. A lot of companies and a lot of people indeed believe that they are kind of doing the right thing by recycling, but they never sort of tend to think about reusing, preventing or reducing. That said, we're now getting some different models coming through to add to this. So there's a whole new industry actually that's erupted out of refurbishing stuff and upcycling. We're starting to see more products get repaired and upgraded. We're starting to see people sell stuff that they don't want quite massively, mainly because of the advent of eBay and Facebook Marketplace and all the other online selling sites. And obviously there's the donate element of this. And actually you could probably add to that re-gift for people who get presents that they don't actually want. So basically this is what our waste looks like, sort of the hierarchy. So for me, managing waste, and that's not just the stuff that goes in your bin, managing waste is at the heart of your environmental impacts. So waste, it's more than just the stuff that ends up in your bin or your skip. It's more than the stuff that goes into your recycling bin. It's actually anything that doesn't make it into your final product or service. So that could be offcuts, it could be run-ons, it could be overruns, could be wasted water, wasted energy, it could be packaging, wasted labour, materials, transport. All of those essentially lead to increased carbon emissions. So waste is just basically anything that isn't essential for your product and service. To cut down on all of our waste, we need to measure, monitor, and manage it through our businesses. I know Warren's going to actually talk quite considerably more about how we do that in his presentation, so I'm not actually going to cover that element of it. What I want to talk about is environmental management systems. Okay, so 14001 is the internationally recognised standard for environmental management systems, and it is essentially exactly what it says on the cover. I won't claim it's a page turner, but it is actually a standard that provides a framework or a structure that you can use to actually manage your environmental impacts. The standard's actually built on the same framework as quality and health and safety. So if you're operating those systems in your business, this will mesh in with it really easily. And they're also structures that you can use to manage those impacts as well, or to manage quality, manage health and safety. Okay, so the standard itself, basically it has a number of clauses. It actually has 10 in total. I'm not going to go into all of them because some of them are just things like what they call normative references of all things. And that's essentially the terminology that's used in the standard. But the main things you would need to know within the standard, firstly, is your environmental policy. You need to write a policy. Now, your policy is essentially a statement of intent. It's not the whole thing that you're going to do to manage your environmental management, your environmental system. What it should say is essentially what your company does, your intention in relation to your legal obligations, i.e. we pledge not to break the law, however you want to say that. It must have a commitment not to pollute, a general commitment to meet the requirements of the standard, and to manage and reduce your environmental impacts continuously. Your policy doesn't need specific figures. If you start saying we're going to reduce our recycling by 10%, and you have that year on year, you're going to very quickly run into problems, I would suggest. So you're better off saying that you're committed to increasing recycling or increasing reuse or cutting waste. But it should be a statement of intent rather than something that's very, very specific. And probably most important of all, it needs to be signed by a senior manager and dated. And that actually indicates that your manager is in favour of this, behind it, and will cooperate with everybody to make sure that it happens. So that's your policy. Following on from that, there are two real linchpins of the standard. The first one is what we used to call a legal register, and it's now called your compliance obligations, but essentially it's much the same thing. It's basically a table that you set up and you go away, you investigate what legislation or environmental legislation anyway relates to your company. You can find this on the Environment Agency website, which is now part of the government website. You've got various companies that will do it for you, but for most companies, it's essentially waste legislation that applies to you. But you need to have considered all of the legal obligations that you have, and then basically you have a table, you set out what it is, how it applies to you, and how you meet it. Simple as that. You update it every year, and essentially that is something that must run through all of your business, is that you are meeting your legal obligations. The next table or element, which is the second linchpin of the standard, is what's called the Aspects and Impacts Register. Now, this is essentially, again, a table, and what you do is you will identify your business's activities. You will identify, as a result of that, your aspect, which is how that aspect interacts with the environment, and then you move on to the impact it has on the environment. It sounds quite complicated, but it isn't really. I'll give you a for instance. Your activity would be maybe car washing on site. So your aspect is use of a cleaning agent. Your impact potentially is water pollution. Now, what you do for your entire business is run through your activities, look at your aspects, look at your impacts, and then you have to set a scale up to actually say which is the most significant. Now, you may determine that on the basis of it happens all the time. You may set it on it's a legal requirement. That would probably make it very significant. And essentially, you determine what makes those aspects and impacts significant, and then you address them in order. So effectively, once you've got that set out, you can look at it and go, okay, my significant impacts are use of energy, generation of waste, and maybe transportation. As a consequence of that, you can now say, okay, I need to address these, so I need to plan how I'm going to do that and set objectives. And essentially from there, obviously, you look at implementing that. So that would be a set of SMART objectives. Who's going to do it? How are you going to go about it? The time scale. Are there any obstacles? How are you going to overcome them? So on and so forth. But essentially, you go away and you do this. Following that, you're looking at having a review. So you look at all of these things again, including your policy, because you may want to add things in, you may want to take things out, you may want to adjust it. But every year or so, you should have a management meeting where you review your entire system. And having done that, you set new objectives for continuous improvement. So effectively, you're constantly going through a loop of writing your policy, looking at your legal and compliance obligations. And just as an aside on that one, we've got a fairly major piece of legislation running through government at the moment called the Environment Bill. That is going to change masses of the current legislation. And that one is one that you will probably need to watch out for. It will change a lot of things, probably including the way we deal with waste. following that, your aspects and impacts you need to revisit regularly, because essentially you may have dealt with your most significant impact. You may have decided that you're going to put solar panels up on your roof, so you're actually generating more energy than you need. So you may then actually want to say, well, okay, that's no longer a significant impact. I need to change what I'm doing and look at something else instead. I should also mention that within that, you need to mention what you're doing that benefits the environment as well. So if you're, say, planting trees, or you're part of some kind of carbon reduction program, you need to put that into your aspects and impacts register as well as a positive. Okay, moving on. Okay, so what are the benefits of having an environmental management system? So first of all, you will meet the law, or you should meet the law if you're doing it properly. So environmental fines have gone up massively over the last 20 years, I would say. Certainly, I mean, starting out, I think going back 20 years, we were looking at people who were really doing some terrible pollution, and they were getting maybe a £5 fine. You'd be looking at probably 250 grand these days for the same offence. If you repeatedly offend, you can go to prison these days, which is probably a good thing. The other benefit is top-down sustainability. So there is a requirement for everyone in the organisation to actually consider sustainability in their roles. So you're not only looking at management being involved in the system, you're looking at maybe your design department, your waste department, health and safety, admin, buying and selling. And selling is actually, buying, sorry, is quite an important one, because if you want to be green, you should be buying from other green suppliers. We're measuring, monitoring and managing our impacts, which leads to the next two, which is continuously improving your impact on the environment. But it will also, if you're cutting energy and you're cutting waste and you're cutting water, it will save money off your bottom line. It's a no-brainer. Attracting talent. What I'm seeing at the moment is very much from our younger generations. They do not want to work for polluting businesses. They don't even want to work for businesses that are sort of heavy carbon generators. They actually want to work for decent, socially responsible businesses. So actually managing your impacts and having an environmental management system may well help you to attract talent. It can help you to plan improvements in a phased manner. So if you're actually looking at potentially replacing your heating systems or your lighting or any of those types of infrastructure projects, it will help you to plan those improvements over in a phased period over and actually to realise the benefits of those. I think I said previously, it integrates really well with quality and health and safety management system standards. And the last one is something that I'm very much aware of at the moment, because wearing another hat, I actually write bids for companies who are tendering for government contracts. And I would say most of them now are saying, have you got 14,001? If you have, you can tick a box. If you haven't, you are having to write on average, I would say 10 pages of stuff to prove that you're doing what you say you're doing, and justifying how you're doing it. So for that reason alone, if you are tendering for a lot of government contracts, it's probably worth your while going through this process. Okay, that is me. I've probably rush through that a little bit, but you're more than welcome to ask me any questions you want a bit later on. And without further ado, I will hand over to Warren.
Can I briefly interrupt before you start, Warren?
Yep, sure.
I just wanted to pick up on a few of the things that Jane said. especially as we are running quite nicely to time. So I've got some time to say some extra things. So thank you, Jane. Jane talked about recycling and about the sort of expanded sort of areas where, you know, it's more than just recycling. I wanted to mention that CCF runs some really great repair cafes. You mentioned repair. I also wanted to mention, Jane talked about ISO 14001, and ISO 14001, absolutely couldn't agree with you more. If you're in this industry where, or an organisation where you're going for lots of tenders, especially with public contracts, you know, you can just tick that box and have it. You probably already have ISO 14001 in that, if you're in that situation. It doesn't have to be ISO 14001 to put an EMS in place. You can put a completely non-accredited system in place, which will still get you a lot of the benefits of reducing those costs, wastes, etc. IIE accreditation is actually designed to align really nicely with ISO 14001 standards. So some of our members have IIE accreditation and ISO 14001. And one of the differences is that you actually get support putting the system in place. I know Jane, GBN also supports organisations to put EMSs and particularly ISO 14001 in place. Also, you can get B Corp accreditation. So there's lots of different options. You can choose, you know, the one which is most appropriate for your organisation. I also want to pick up very briefly, Jane mentioned, don't give really specific targets in your ambitions. I would make an exception personally, and I'd be interested to ask Jane if she feels the same. We're quite actively trying to encourage all of our businesses to think longer term. So maybe to think about becoming carbon neutral or net zero carbon by 2030. So I would say if you're looking in the longer term, those more specific ambitions are appropriate. But I agree with Jane, otherwise, you know, you don't want to say 10% every year, otherwise it will be tricky. I think Jane's agreeing there. Okay, and then the last point I wanted to make, Jane mentioned attracting talent. Again, couldn't agree with you more. And we have a really good presentation available on YouTube. So this is from the IIE award ceremony last year. We had Alice Troiano talk about how forward thinking is your company, and she goes into a lot more detail about the research that her organisation has done, particularly looking at millennial attitudes to the products that they're buying, but also the companies that they're choosing to work for. So it's not just in terms of attracting talent to your company, it's also in terms of you know, getting new customers, perhaps by being able to demonstrate that, you know, you're not just doing this to sell a product, you're also, you know, working towards a bigger vision. So yeah, that's all I want to say. I'm going to hand over to Warren. Oh, and I just wanted to add, please feel free to type questions in the chat.
Sorry, folks, I've got 3 screens up and it's not liking the right screen.
I had a question, Claire, earlier from
Yeah, I was just about to say there's a couple of questions. So do you want to try and sort out your screen and we'll go through the questions while we wait. So Nicole asked a question, which is a good one, which is around who takes responsibility for the environmental management system. So I'll pass over to Jane, but first I'm going to sort of say who I normally work with. So it's such a massive range, and it really depends on whether it's a small organisation or a big organisation. So if it's a big organisation, then there's probably even a team of people that are involved with it, and that might be a specific sustainability professional. They might have somebody working on their travel commitments. They might have somebody looking at the building management, so somebody from facilities management. They might have other, procurement experts that work on the buying side of things, all working together to make sure all of the sustainability aspects are considered. Then with the smaller kind of organisations that we work for, it's a real mix of people, but there's often similarities. So the people I often work with, it's one of two things. One, it's somebody who's volunteered because they're really passionate about it and they're really willing to go the extra mile, and they're worth their weight in gold, even if they're not necessarily sustainability professionals right now. If they're enthusiastic about it, they will really go the extra mile putting the EMS in place. The other people I often work with, health and safety professionals, so somebody who's already running the health and safety within the organisation. Jane mentioned that ISO 14001 can be integrated with some of the other ISOs, 8001, and I forget which the other one is, the health and safety and the quality side of things. So it might be that it's somebody from a health and safety or quality or both that is taking on board environmental management as well. And the other type of person is often a marketing person. So the company has recognised that they want to have an environmental management system in place, mainly because they want to shout about it and to show their customers they're doing something. So they want the marketing person involved to make sure they're not only doing stuff. And also marketing people are quite good at maintaining the internal communications that are necessary for environmental management systems, so that they're good on that side of things. So that's who I often work with. Would you agree, Jane? You're muted, Jane.
Apologies.
There we go.
My mouse is behaving rather peculiarly. I went to a presentation recently, actually. It was quite an interesting one. It was a guy locally who'd had a full epiphany a couple of years ago, and he just went, I can't carry on doing my business in the way I was, and turned the whole thing around in 18 months. Absolutely incredible what he's done, but he actually led it himself, and he talked to his staff and said, this is what we're going to do, and they just did it. There wasn't sort of any mucking about or anything, but that's what can happen if you've got fully committed management support. I've got other companies that we're dealing with. There were a couple of salespeople who actually installed the ISO 14001 system in one of them. They wanted to do it because they were passionate about the environment, and they went to their bosses and went, can we do this? Their bosses said, yeah, you can, and they did it. And, you know, just some fantastic stories about people who've got on and done it without the need for hefty consultant input or anything like that. But I think the main thing generally is that you've got management support. Obviously, if you've got a massive company, you're going to have probably an environmental manager or a team. I mean, if you're Network Rail, you've got a team. If you're Unilever, you've probably got an entire division devoted to it, and still not getting very far. Oops, political point. But generally, yes, it very much depends on the size of the company. I've known companies where the receptionist deals with it. It just depends who wants to, who's willing to do it, and the size of the company.
Yeah, I agree completely. There's one more question that we could do if you want to wait a minute. Warren, is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So Katie Doig asks, apologies if I pronounce that incorrectly. The company that I work for is a technology development consultancy. We are involved in lots of different sorts of projects for clients in a range of sectors. To what extent / in what way should the nature of the projects that the organisation takes on be considered? It says considered in, I think that should say, in the ISO 14001. Sorry, I need to scroll down. Aspects, there we go. I'm going to pass that over to Jane. It's an unusual question. It's not one that actually many of the organisations I work for consider, but I do have a few that have made a conscious choice to completely avoid working with kind of any organisations that they don't align with in terms of values. But anyway, I will pass over to Jane and see what she says.
Okay, I have actually answered this in the chat.
Oh, okay, sorry, I didn't see that.
No worries, I mean, it's there, so obviously you've got an answer for it later. 14001 could be done on a project by project basis, but normally you would only look at your own aspects, not those of your client. So anything that is under your direct control or your direct influence is your responsibility under your environmental management system. You can also define right from the outset what you're going to cover in your scope. So you can say, unless you're a transport company and you say, I'm going to leave the transport out of it, which you're not allowed to do. But you can say, we're not going to cover certain elements of your business under your environmental management system. But generally, if you're working for other people, their aspects are not your responsibility. You can advise them, you can try to influence them, but that's not what your environmental management system is there to do. It's actually to cover what you do, not what they're doing.
I think that's a really good answer, Jane. Just making sure you're very firm about what scope it is that the environmental management system is covering. And I would say that the organisations that I've worked for where they've decided against sort of working with particular clients for environmental reasons, it's either because they're purpose driven from the outset, or they've been running an environmental management system for a series of years and they've sort of decided, right, we've reduced everything else we can, now we're going to start pushing things onto our the people that supply us and even our clients to make sure we're doing everything we can, and they've widened the scope of their EMS to include that. But anyway, I will pass over to Warren now. It looks like you've got all your slides sorted.
Cool. So everyone, you can see okay. Excellent. Right. Following on from Jane's 14001 is quite right. All the BSI standards now are aligned, so the middle section of all of them have a plan, do, check, act process to it. So they've harmonized it. It's very important to look at SMART targets. I'll go into more detail with that on the following slide, but it's just a process where you find what you do, you measure it, then you assess, then you decide, is it okay? Do I need to do something more to it? Do I need to change it? You then put the changes into place, follow them through, and then you start the process all over again. Here we go. Very sensitive mouse. So, as I say, to manage, you need to know what you're doing. Now, at this point in time, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at waste, cartridges, water, or energy. The entire process is going to be the same. We've had the two different opinions on setting targets and measurement. I have found in the past that if you don't measure what you're doing, there's not a great deal of change to it. But at the same point in time, I've seen people go to implement systems that are so complicated, they'd be better off with NASA than it will be with a normal company. So when you start, if you're starting for the first time, keep it simple. Just check a few items, start with perhaps a handful, get it going, get it right, and then your next target can then be expanding the amount of bits that are measured and monitored as it moves along. It's also very important to remember the difference between monitoring and evaluation. With monitoring, you're effectively counting, collecting data, and then the evaluation is what you do with the data once you've got it and you've got it sorted. Now, I do have a background in doing ESOS and doing SECR calculations, for which an intensity ratio is very important. The reason why it's important because at some point you need to decide where are you making the improvements. Quite often you're having to sell these sort of schemes to a finance manager or director who may not be that keen. If you're coming across that sort of barrier, that's where I found the best way to put the message is carbon is cash. So if you're having an intensity ratio in how much carbon you're producing, you can make it quite clear. The more you reduce the carbon, the more money you're going to save. Normally their ears prick up and then they move away incredibly well. Now, whilst I have case studies at the end of the presentation, the two pictures on here, left and right, is from an energy survey that I did in a small cafe, where his bills were very high. So I said on the right hand side, where's that cable going to that's going through the ceiling? Basically, he was powering someone else's industrial unit further around the complex, and we actually got him a £500 refund off his energy bill because he had no idea. But he had no idea because he never asked, he never kept an eye on his bills, he just paid the bills. So again, it comes back to even the most simplest things that we can do. When collecting data and so forth, you need to be sure that it's credible. And then also while collecting, you need to be sensitive to other people's backgrounds, requirements and so forth, just to make sure that you're not going to accidentally upset someone by what you're looking into with where you're going and then how you're developing your intensity ratio. These are some examples actually given on the Energy Managers Association training course. It could be anything. It depends what area you work in. It doesn't have to be carbon. It could be measured in other units as well. But if you don't have a measurement that you're checking on, then it would be difficult to compare at a later date when doing such things. On the electricity front, it is amazing the amount of times that I've been to a factory where they just pay the bill. They don't even look. Quite often they won't even know where the electricity meter is, let alone how it works. And this does tie into the one of the case studies that we have later on. Here we have whether it's half-hourly data or whether or not it's like a standard tariff. The numbers here, 1, 2, 3, that shows how many tariffs that the meter is available to record. If it's not half-hourly, you might have a morning and evening. For this one, you can actually have a morning, evening and weekend, which is quite often common for the electricity. And then there we have the core number further there. So it's knowing what you've got, what to look for. This is a typical piece of half-hourly data. You just need to have the meter change, it's recorded, you get it in a spreadsheet, and then you can actually put it into what will be classed as a heat map or graph format to then actually see what you've got, what you're using. This is an example, which is also in the case study further back, 24-hour data, or half-hourly data rather, that's been annualized. And this shows the typical average daily function for the normal working week. Now, I must hasten to add in this that the normal working time is from 8:45 to 4:45 in the afternoon. And as you can see here at midnight, you're getting little spikes that are coming up. Then the factory actually starts ramping up its energy consumption from 3 o'clock in the morning, even though they're not actually going to start work till 8:45. 6 and 7, huge spike. Then again, normally this profile here you'd expect to be rounded as it comes around. As you get the peak at lunchtime, then it goes down. So just as they're going home, yeah, that could be hand washing and everything else. But when the door is shut, you're still quite high with some odd fluctuations. Normally that would mean you've got machines that are automated, coming on and off at different times, but often where they're not really aware. There's a more interesting picture, later on with the case study. Now there are a number of guides that are available. They are very old though. mostly from about 2010, for around about that. All these links will take anyone to where the different guides are stored. It covers the hotels, offices, all sorts of different buildings. So that can be an interesting use for those that want to have a look. As mentioned at the top of the slide here, these are all the places where you have the biggest amount of energy consumption and the biggest opportunity to have them on automated controls that no one will realize where they are. So it's always worthwhile, if you think your bill's a bit high, to look around and have a check. Here is details of a monitoring company where you can buy energy monitors and so forth. The SMAPI is quite a very good system. It can connect to these snap-on devices. There's no wiring, you don't have to wire it in, it just goes over the top. Some of the other monitors, loggers and so forth, they have what's known as a tail, although that's a better one there. You just literally wrap it around any electrical cable that you want to measure and it will log the data for you. I actually recommended this system, the SMAPI one, to the company in the case study. And I will cover that a little bit later there. They are a very nice firm. I've worked with them on a number of occasions and they will be very straightforward and simple with you. They won't make anything or big it up. But a small spend on these could save a lot of money. Now, when it comes to doing the measuring, monitoring of anything, you really got to make sure that you pick the right project first. And then the other thing is the person that's actually going to be having a look. I love this photograph as it's showing the two railway lines not quite getting it together. If you've got people doing the measuring who aren't going to talk to the monitoring people and so forth, it can cause all sorts of issues. Ideally, someone who is very OCD about following procedure, checking on things, taking measurements and making sure they can pass it on are actually perfect. But again, it's all the basic things as to over what time, is it going to be permanent? Do you need to make other changes into shift patterns or other stuff to ensure that you're getting all the detail that you need? And then also deciding as to who's going to do the work. Now, Jane described earlier that there are some companies that are out there which will just get on, do the whole lot and not muck about and get everything done. But unfortunately, for some of the bigger companies, you've got everyone with their little kingdoms. They might not want something to work. Oh dear, do we get the count wrong on that one? Oh, fancy that. So again, it's making sure that you have a sensible logging system and sensible people in actual fact doing the work. Now, again, I've got here looking for energy patterns, but it could be water consumption. It could be that paper consumption is going up in the office, or some ink cartridges are going spare somewhere. It can be all things from stuff as silly as people not repairing machines properly, so they use extra and so forth. And again, this is just the basic checklist that can be used as it is. I won't read through the whole lot, but as you can see, typically with the case study that we're coming up to, you work at a set hour. The biggest thing that I found is that people just don't check the bill. They will actually just pay the bill and carry on, and then no one will ever look any further. Information can be taken off the plates. Most equipment will have a machinery plate somewhere which will have the load. The load will typically be in kilowatt hours, and that gives an opportunity to take enough base information for someone to do the calculations to see what it should be using. Again, just a quick run of the 24-hour. Here we have a example of a shop that was actually across the road from the old PACT office in Peterborough. They were looking at trying to get some additional heating put in. Their consumption was pretty much normal, but what they'd not thought about was actually retrofitting doors on the front of the fridges. If they'd have actually retrofitted doors on, which would have been about 1,100 quid each, they actually would have taken away the need to put additional heating in, because when you walked into the shop, as Claire can probably confirm, it was like walking into a fridge the minute you actually went into the shop itself. All the energy coming out in cold, away from the product. Now, this is where we're starting on the case study, which was a spice warehouse. This is a daily profile that actually comes from the annualized profile that I showed earlier. Now, as you can see on the line there, that is where they were with the Christmas shutdown. You can't get this so you can see it any better than this, but each one of these lines actually shows an individual daily peak. They were getting this information all the time, but no one was looking at it, just paying the bill. One of the more important things was with this one is the red line denotes where their capacity charge is. That will be the maximum demand, which is done in kilovolt amps. That line says how much capacity the electricity company can actually give the factory. If you go over that amount, then you get an extra fine, effectively, or extra charge on your electricity bill. Typically, if you were going to leave everything on in one go that they had in the factory, put the lights on 24 hours a day, the maximum energy reading should have been where the green line is. But realistically, they should actually be somewhere down here, around about 30 kilowatts per day. This I've gone in for a little bit closer shot where he is. As you can see, you can clearly see that the Christmas peak there where they had a shutdown, which was there. And again, they're only working sort of 8:30, 8:45 till 5:45. So it's amazing over time with just how much more they're using. What was even more interesting with this is a shot of the inside that they have outside. Relatively modern building, so it shouldn't be consuming too much. But they've got a couple of weighing machines, some heat sealers that are there, a binding machine, an electric fork truck. It should not have been physically possible to have used the amount of energy that they were using with the equipment that they've had. I recommended doing some monitoring and walking about and checking the machines. In the end, they were going to do just the very basic method of go around and turn everything off and then just only start turning individual bits on here or there. The reason for the picture of the light up here is it was a T8 tube that's failing, and you can just work out in that little bit there where it's beginning to glow orange on either end. With a tube like this, it can use 7 times the normal amount of electricity because it's trying to build up the charge to arc from one side to another. And if you've got 4 or 5 of those that are on for a good 10-hour shift, they're going to use a huge amount of electricity. This is the second case study that I used. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get permission to have the personal data from the company, so I've done it from memory and just done a very basic layout of where we are. Now, this was due as part of a ESOS assessment, which is one of the bigger companies where they have to report every 4 years or else they can get up to £100,000 fine. Now, the guy was telling me that they were very well controlled with electricity. It was really pretty good. All of these buildings had meters in, as did the lab, the main office, and then there is the dispatch warehouse that they had. I was also assured when I arrived on site that all these buildings up the top didn't use any electricity at all, barely anything, because some of them are just stores. In the end, when I started reviewing the bills, that one building in red was using more electricity than these 3 and those 2 together. And again, they were just kept paying the bills and paying the bills without even checking to see why. The meters in all these buildings were right at the back on the back wall, and they all had racks put in front of them. So it actually took nearly 20 minutes in each building actually to find the meter, let alone actually get to have a look and then put the bills to the different numbers. In this building here, it was fairly typical. They assemble routers, cables, everything that you want to use to connect to the internet. And they also had contract workers that were in to do the assembly. Now, the only equipment that they had that drew energy were the hot water geyser, the convector heaters, and then a number of lights with your nice little orangey bit on the ends that were there. The guy, good to his word, by the time I'd got from that building to that building, he had his electrician up with a ladder and the lights were changed instantly, which was quite a nice win for a change. The only thing is that it's unusual to have an area which is so good with all the meters in place, and it would have been such an opportunity to put the SMAPI system in and literally record everything from all the buildings and have it come to one desktop where you can actually have a look and see if there was any unusual use. We worked out that they must have been the assembly workers leaving the heaters on overnight so they could walk in the morning to a nice warm building, and then not everyone was checking to see that the lights were off. So then where you've got these lights that are using 7 times more, they're actually being left on 24 hours a day. Now, from memory, that one building cost them an extra £5,500 in 1 year in their electricity consumption. Pretty much, in fact, actually the cost of the survey that they had undertaken. It would have been nice if we'd have known that they were going to be monitoring. With some changes to different lighting around the area, they actually were looking at whatever they spent, they would have returned their money within about 3 years. And when you can then convert the carbon as cash the other way back, the carbon savings that they could have made would have been substantial through that. And this is pretty much all through complacency, not checking to see what they've got, where it was, or what they were using at that point in time. It's a shame that unfortunately this sort of thing isn't quite so common. So other than that, the energy spend wasn't too bad, but in this case, just the one building. The result was, as I've said to them, is to actually set timers on the heaters and the geyser, because there was nothing there, with the idea that it will come on at a set time in the morning, and then you have the timers that have the option of like an hour's override, so you can turn it on just for an hour, so it can't be left on again all overnight. A very straightforward, simple solution for that. Oh, now, as part of the work that I do, I'm also the project manager of the Eastern New Energy project. I've just included some details on these slides because they'll be handed out as we come through. I'll let everyone have a read of that later. And that brings me roughly to, I think, where we should be for the question and answers.
Perfect. Thank you, Warren. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then
Yep,
we'll just have a chat with everybody? Just makes it slightly easier to see the chat. So there was a question from Hannah Thomas about exemplary environmental management systems. So I'll let Warren and Jane mention any particular ones they know of. But I think some of the famous ones that I can think of would be M&S is probably the biggest. Brewdog is another really good one. But as Jane has already said, you know, they're not going to have their full environmental management system up available for everybody to see. Aside from anything else, it's just way too much information for the average person. But also there's a lot of commercially sensitive data because we're looking at energy reads and material being purchased, etc. So not the sort of information they would want to have on a public forum. But IIE do have lots of green level members. So we've actually got 3 different accreditation levels: bronze, silver and green. We've got lots of really great members. If you want to have a look through our membership, and then I think you can filter and see which ones are green, and that might give you a bit more information. You know, you can just have a look around at their websites and just see what they're doing. You know, it's probably mainly going to be the environmental policy and kind of communicating their commitment, but often there's kind of blog posts about what they're doing, specific projects, etc. So yeah, Warren and Jane, do you want to mention anyone else in particular that you can think of that are really exemplary?
I don't think you're going to get somebody like you say, publishing their entire system, because that doesn't happen. They don't like to give that away. What I will say is that most companies will publish their environmental policy. So if you want to have a look at those as an example of what you should be doing, they're great. There's plenty of those out there. Some of them not so good, some of them are better. But generally you can get a feel for what you need to put into that. But what I would say as well is if anybody is desperate for sort of a template for a legal register or an aspects and impacts register, I can supply you with those probably, because I've got them anyway.
Very kind, thank you. But IIE membership also includes template, but obviously that comes with a price. So that's a very kind offer, Jane, thank you. Warren, did you have anybody else you wanted to sort of put forward as a real exemplar of running an EMS?
Well, it's interesting that there's been the link sent for the Brewdog page.
Yeah.
I actually follow them on LinkedIn. They seem to be doing quite a good job as they go. No, I mean, I'm afraid, unfortunately, I've probably met more people that weren't entirely sure as to what they were doing than they were. There is two software companies in Swavesey that had, one certainly had the best office that I'd ever been in, clean and tidy, knew where everything was. But no, unfortunately, most places you go, there is something which is a bit off and a bit strange. And yeah, just going back to some of these other points that were made, it has been my experience with the larger companies that do lease out to smaller companies, they are incredibly unhelpful, never want to share any information, and it doesn't particularly matter for them if you reduce your energy, because they charge a proportion of the rent to cover it. I would strongly recommend that if you are renting an office, some of the sensors you can get for logging are not particularly expensive. It might be a couple of £100 in order to get one. You don't even have to wire it in. You can just clip it on where your mains come in, just to let you know what you've got. And if they want to set the target just to see whether they can reduce a bit here or there, then that's something that can be done quite simply.
Yeah, so that's Nicola Terry's question about tenants and whether the landlords are obligated to provide any monitoring data. And I think Jane's put some information in there that agrees with essentially what Warren said. I would echo that. Often landlords are not massively helpful, but if you are persistent and probably polite about it as well, usually you can get a lot of the data, especially the energy. It might be that it's data for the building overall, and you might only rent a proportion of the building, so you might need to proportion that data out to give you something which is appropriate to the amount of space that you occupy. So you might estimate that based on number of staff or floor space that you occupy. Or if they won't give you that data, it is possible to start trying to estimate. And what certainly we do at IIE, where we have businesses who are tenants, and if they really can't get that data, and sometimes even where there's ownership of the building, you just can't get data for things like water because there's no water meter installed and the water provider won't put a water meter in. So what we try to emphasize in that sort of situation is to focus on your action plans. So if you can't monitor, I mean, monitor if you can, because that will give you real figures of has this worked or has this not worked, etc. Or is there anything we're missing even? But if you can't, then yeah, just shift that focus onto that action plan and trying to kind of put in place different things that will reduce energy, water, waste, all the different resources that you've deemed as significant. Right, there was also one more question from Nicola Terry. She wanted to know a bit more about the SMAPI, Warren, and whether that measured flow.
Yeah, in fact, the little green sensor that I put on, that can actually be used to measure water and gas. It's pulse enabled, so if you have a meter that has a pulse function on it, it can be connected to that and it will determine by the pulse from the meter as to how much gas has been used. For water flow, you're always better if you can to have an inline meter, but those sort of things are the next best choice. And again, you don't have to make any holes, it just clips over the top. I believe the little green one, from when I was reading about it, it can connect to a Wi-Fi within 20 meters, The rest of them can all actually connect via Wi-Fi senders and an existing Ethernet network. And then if you check out the company's webpage, it has all the details for the different software where you can have sort of like a desktop analysis of all the energy or utilities that you're consuming. It's nice and simple. The equipment is relatively cheap compared to others that is available on the market. But I think the most important thing is that they are actually helpful as a company, which is why I've stayed in touch with them for so long. I do have some case studies that they've sent me that I can send in to be sent out if anyone has any interest in that, with doing different things. They're relatively industrial, it has to be said, but it gives an indication as to what they can do.
That might be interesting if you send them through to Nicole, and then we'll figure out whether we can get them out to everybody. That would be great.
Yeah, just one other thing with the guides that I mentioned earlier, they do enable people to work out roughly how much energy they would consume on a square meter basis for the particular different types of buildings. And the other thing that I would strongly recommend is the Charity Pact had the BCP project, where it was possible for someone to go and do a free energy survey of different companies. It was incredibly difficult to get it started because everyone said it's for free, what's the catch? But if you want to get some calculations done to find out where you are for a baseline, if you like, for your company, do keep an eye out for the free funded surveys that are there. They really can be quite useful.
Yes, they're still offering them via ENE. Sorry, I don't know if you mentioned that. So yeah, that's well worth looking out for. Right, there's been another question. Nicola was just asking about green building groups for tenants to kind of get together and put some pressure on the landlords. And yes, again, that's something we absolutely advocate. Even if you're not having problems with your tenant, with your landlord, sorry, if you're working within a shared building, we would absolutely recommend that you try and get together with the other tenants of the building and try and work together to reduce whatever various resources are being used. Because if you're occupying one of 5 floors, then you doing stuff on your own isn't necessarily going to have a really big measurable impact. Whereas if you can get, you know, 3 or 4 companies working together doing the same initiatives, that's more likely to have a bigger impact that you can then measure and see. And again, it's making it bigger than yourselves. It's doing something, you know, that you can really grab hold of, and you know, that's a really nice message to communicate as well. So well worth doing. I think we might be coming towards the end of the question. Jane put an extra comment just about auditing. You should be auditing your systems and your buildings to avoid situations like those that Warren talked about. So part of ISO 14001 is fairly regular audits. Part of IIE accreditation is making sure that you not just monitor your energy, water, whatever other resources, but you're also analysing that data. So figuring out, why is this higher or lower than last year? Why is this happening? Have the things we've put in place, have they worked? If they haven't, why not, etc. So yes, definitely auditing. I'm just going to have a quick check. Oh, also, Alana posted with regards to the SMAPIs, CCF actually has some electricity monitors which attach to the mains, which we are happy to loan out for free. So I did not know that, but that sounds very interesting, very worthwhile. If people want to get in touch and borrow those, that could be really interesting. Okay. Elizabeth says, surely it would be in landlords' interest to reduce energy and water use. Not necessarily. They might just kind of, they might, usually what happens is that the tenants are actually recharged for the energy and water, so it doesn't matter to the landlord because they're not paying it, whereas they might have to pay for the upfront investment. Obviously, if they have included electricity, water, gas or whatever as part of the overall price, that gives them a much bigger incentive to then reduce that if they're actually directly paying that. Again, something that we try to encourage is working in partnership with the landlord. So it might be that the tenant organisation or organisations suggest, well, how about we share out the cost of doing this? Or, you know, maybe the tenant thinks about how long they're going to occupy the building, because sometimes things like LEDs, Warren knows this well, we worked together on the BCP project and did a lot of looking at paybacks for LEDs, and often the paybacks for the things like that were within 1, 2, 3 years. And when you're looking at that sort of payback, if you've got a building that you're occupying for 10 years, it makes sense. You're going to get a payback within that 10 years, so it's well worthwhile. There's also options for things where you don't pay for upfront costs, and Warren knows more about those.
Yeah, it is, well, the LED people went to an area where you could effectively lease your equipment for roughly the same price. The money reduction that you get in your bill normally went to the people that were providing the light, but you were sort of still paying a little bit less anyway. And then you'd buy your lights at the end of your allotted period for about £1, and then that's it. They just stayed in and they were kept. The advantages though also with moving to LED is the fact that you don't have to have anyone on a cherry picker or any high scaffold to go around changing the light bulbs quite so often, which is one other useful thing. And in actual fact, I've heard that there have been studies done in schools and other areas that they actually find working under LED light can be a lot more calming and a lot more pleasant for people than the stark fluorescent lights as well.
Especially for adults and children with sensory processing issues. So that might be autism, that might be other sensory processing issues, or it might just be your average human being that doesn't have a specific diagnosis or of anything, but is quite sensitive to light. One of the comments that we most often get after LEDs are put in place is, wow, the light quality is so much better, that's amazing. So doing all this green stuff often has unintended other beneficial consequences.
Oh, actually, I've just remembered there was an ESOS assessment I did up in Scotland. There was a lady there in one office surrounded by LED lighting. Because they had lots of flickering fluorescent, it actually made her physically ill and it damaged her eyesight, and they actually had to change the lighting in her work environment to literally prevent her from losing her sight in one eye. So yeah, it is possible to also be mildly negligent with some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we've dealt with all of the questions, so I'm going to wrap things up. So I just wanted to let you know, if you do want more support, IIE membership, we are a charity, so there is a cost associated with membership, but it does include things like templates for EMS documentation. We do also have pre-filled example documents, but really your documents need to be your documents. They really need to be tweaked to your specific organisation, your ambitions, where you are now, etc. And we also provide that tailored one-to-one support to kind of guide you along, start you off, and then we have quarterly catch-up calls to kind of say, hey, how did that work out? What are you going to do next, etc. We also do lots of different training opportunities. GBN, actually, I was surprised Jane didn't mention it, but GBN also had lots of excellent training opportunities that are available, so well worth checking out the GBN site for their training opportunities. And then I just wanted to kind of go back to a slide which I've kind of tried to show throughout this ambition to action series, which is the key elements of an EMS. So in our first session about carbon footprinting, we talked about calculating the carbon footprint and as part of that measuring usage. And then today we talked a bit about environmental policy, measuring usage, setting targets, creating an action plan, which the waste management and travel plan kind of feed into those. The session, so hopefully you've got a kind of a good foundation, but the session in 2 weeks' time on the 8th of June is going to then be covering the communication and engagement side of things, and that will also cover appointing green champions. So next session, 8th of June, same time, same place probably, depending wherever you want to watch it from. Key topics are getting public recognition for your progress, reaching out to new customers and communicating your environmental efforts to clients, green champions, and wider staff engagement, including keeping staff engaged once you've started the process. And we've got Dr. Jan Maskell, who's a registered occupational psychologist. She works for both IIE and also Training and Development Solutions, and is also a lecturer with Lancaster University. So she's a real expert about, so she'll be talking more about internal communications. She's a real expert. We're really lucky to have her. And then we've also got Peter Gilheeney, who is director at Forster Communications, which is a social communications, social change communications agency. And that was awarded Sustainability Agency of the Year in 2021. So again, a real expert. So that's more about communicating your achievements externally to prospective clients, etc. So lots of you are probably signed up for these or this one already. If you haven't already, please feel free to sign up for that one. And all that remains to be said is thank you so much to Jane and Warren for coming and sharing your expertise today. You did a wonderful job. Also, thank you to everybody who came and attended. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you go and speak to your teams and managers about putting these principles into practice. Also talk to them about the opportunity to sign up to the Charter. And also, if you want more information, there's loads more information on the IIE website and our YouTube channel. It's all freely available, so have a look and a trawl through. If you do want further professional advice about implementing an EMS, do feel free to get in touch with myself. Please also consider signing up to CCF's newsletter, maybe consider volunteering for CCF or make a donation via their website. And I will just mention again, we will share the recording, slides and chat after this event. So hopefully I will see you all on the 8th. Thank you very much.